16 million Americans own an AR-15. That's one in every 20 adults walking around with what politicians call a weapon of war in their closet. But here's what nobody's talking about. 30 years ago, only 400,000 of these rifles existed in the entire country. Something happened between then and now that turned this firearm into the most popular rifle in America. And the answer isn't what you think. The truth involves a government ban that spectacularly backfired, billion-dollar marketing campaigns that weaponized fear itself, and a cultural shift that transformed a piece of metal into the ultimate symbol of American identity. What you're about to discover will change how you see this entire debate. The explosion started quietly. In 1994, America had just 400,000 AR-15 style rifles floating around. These were niche firearms, mostly owned by gun enthusiasts and collectors who appreciated the technical aspects of the platform. The AR-15 wasn't even close to being a household name. Most Americans couldn't tell you what the letters AR stood for, and the rifle certainly wasn't dominating gun store displays or generating heated political debates. It was just another semi-automatic rifle in a market filled with dozens of options. Fast forward to 2020, and that number had erupted to over 20 million. That's a 5,000% increase in just 26 years. To put that in perspective, if AR-15 ownership were a stock, it would be the most successful investment in modern American history. The iPhone, social media, streaming services, none of them experienced growth this dramatic or sustained. But this wasn't organic growth driven by hunting needs or sporting traditions. This was something else entirely, something that caught even the gun industry off guard. The catalyst? A piece of legislation designed to do the exact opposite. September 13, 1994 changed everything. President Clinton signed the federal assault weapons ban into law, and gun manufacturers watched their world turn upside down. The ban prohibited the manufacture and sale of certain semi-automatic firearms and magazines holding more than 10 rounds. It targeted features like pistol grips, folding stocks, and flash suppressors, the aesthetic elements that made rifles look military. The legislation was supposed to make AR-15s disappear from American gun stores, fade into obscurity like outdated technology. Instead, it created the most effective marketing campaign the firearms industry never had to pay for. The moment the government said, "You can't have this," millions of Americans decided they absolutely needed one. It was basic psychology at work, the forbidden fruit effect on a national scale. Gun stores couldn't keep them on shelves. Prices skyrocketed as demand outpaced supply. People who had never considered owning an AR-15 suddenly felt compelled to get one before they disappeared forever. And here's the twist that legislators never saw coming. The ban had a sunset clause, meaning it would expire in 10 years unless Congress voted to renew it. So from 1994 to 2004, Americans bought every AR-15 they could find, stockpiling them like forbidden treasure. Manufacturers worked around the restrictions by removing the banned features, creating ban-compliant models that functioned identically but looked slightly different. The ban didn't reduce access. It just made the rifles slightly less convenient and significantly more desirable. When September 2004 rolled around and Congress let the ban expire without renewal, the floodgates opened. Suddenly, manufacturers could produce AR-15s without restrictions, and a decade of pent-up demand exploded onto the market. But something had fundamentally changed. The AR-15 had transformed from a controversial firearm into a political statement. Owning one meant you were standing up to government overreach, exercising your constitutional rights, making a declaration about freedom itself. The ban had accidentally turned a rifle into a symbol of resistance. The gun industry learned something valuable from that ban, something that would reshape their entire approach to marketing. They learned that fear sells better than bullets ever could. After 9/11, manufacturers completely reimagined how they marketed the AR-15. The attacks created a new kind of anxiety in American culture. People felt vulnerable in ways they hadn't since Pearl Harbor. The government raised threat levels. News channels ran constant coverage of terrorism. And gun manufacturers saw an opportunity. Instead of pitching the AR-15 as a sporting rifle or a collector's item, they leaned hard into military aesthetics and tactical imagery. Advertisements started featuring soldiers in combat gear, urban warfare scenarios, and language borrowed straight from Special Forces recruiting materials. The message was clear: This isn't just a gun, it's the same weapon our military uses to defend freedom overseas, and now you can defend your home with it. Companies like Bushmaster ran campaigns with slogans that would make marketing executives in other industries blush. One ad literally told potential buyers to consider your man card reissued after purchasing their rifle. Another showed the rifle with text reading, "Forces of opposition, bow down, you are single-handedly outnumbered." This wasn't accidental. This was calculated psychological warfare designed to tap into something deeper than just wanting to go shooting on weekends. The marketing teams had figured out they were selling more than a firearm. They were selling empowerment to people who felt increasingly powerless in a changing world. They were selling control to people who felt society was spinning out of their grasp. They were selling strength to men who felt their traditional roles being questioned and diminished. The shift in advertising strategy coincided with broader cultural changes. The 2000s saw the rise of reality TV shows about survivalists and preppers. Cable news became increasingly alarmist, with every local crime story treated like a national emergency. Social media allowed fear to spread faster than facts. Economic instability from the 2008 financial crisis left millions feeling vulnerable and uncertain about the future. Into this environment, gun manufacturers positioned the AR-15 as the ultimate insurance policy. They convinced Americans that the world had become more dangerous, that threats lurked everywhere, and that law enforcement couldn't protect you when seconds counted. The pitch worked because it tapped into genuine anxiety, even if the actual crime statistics told a different story. The numbers tell the story that politics tries to hide. When researchers actually asked AR-15 owners why they bought their rifles, 65% said self-defense, not hunting, not target shooting, not collecting, self-defense. That's a seismic shift from how Americans traditionally thought about firearms. For most of the 20th century, rifles were for hunting deer or varmints, shotguns were for home defense, and handguns were for personal protection. Each firearm had its proper purpose, its traditional role. But something changed in American psychology between the 1990s and today. People started seeing threats everywhere. Mass shooting coverage dominated news cycles, despite such events being statistically rare. Terrorist incidents created constant anxiety, even though the average American faced virtually no terrorism risk. Economic uncertainty made people feel vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety, but everything to do with loss of control. And the AR-15 manufacturers positioned their product as the ultimate answer to all of it. They convinced millions of Americans that the lightweight, semi-automatic rifle with 30-round magazines wasn't overkill for home defense. It was essential. They argued that if multiple intruders broke into your home, you needed maximum firepower. If civil unrest broke out, you needed a rifle capable of defending your property. If society collapsed, you needed the same firearm the military used. The pitch worked because it tapped into genuine fear, even if that fear was statistically disconnected from reality. The average American faces a higher risk of being struck by lightning than needing an AR-15 for self-defense. But fear doesn't operate on statistics. Fear operates on emotion, on worst-case scenarios, on the possibility that you might be that one person who needs it. And gun manufacturers became experts at nurturing that fear without ever explicitly stating it. Behind closed doors, gun manufacturers were printing money. Over the past decade alone, AR-15 sales generated more than $1 billion in revenue for the firearms industry. But this wasn't just about selling a product anymore. Companies discovered they could sell an identity, a lifestyle, a worldview. The marketing evolved beyond just tactical imagery into something more primal and personal. Advertisements started linking AR-15 ownership directly to masculinity, patriotism, and resistance against a government they portrayed as increasingly tyrannical. Young men in particular became the target demographic, with campaigns suggesting that owning an AR-15 was a rite of passage, a way to prove you weren't soft or weak or controlled by liberal politics. Some manufacturers even created social media campaigns encouraging buyers to post photos with their rifles, turning customers into unpaid brand ambassadors. The strategy was brilliant from a business perspective. They weren't selling firearms. They were selling membership into a tribe, an identity you could literally hold in your hands and display to the world. The industry also recognized another powerful motivator: scarcity and urgency. Every time a mass shooting occurred, gun manufacturers saw sales spike. Not despite the tragedy, but because of it. The pattern became predictable. A horrible incident would happen. Politicians would call for stricter gun laws. Media coverage would suggest bans were coming, and millions of Americans would rush to gun stores to buy AR-15s before potential restrictions took effect. Manufacturers learned to quietly increase production ahead of election cycles, knowing that Democratic victories would trigger panic buying. They learned that every legislative proposal, even ones with no chance of passing, generated millions in sales. The gun industry had stumbled into a perfect feedback loop where the very thing that made their product controversial also made it irresistible. Then the AR-15 became something nobody predicted, the single most divisive symbol in American politics. Forget the flag or the anthem or political party logos. The AR-15 transformed into the ultimate litmus test for where you stood on dozens of issues that had nothing to do with firearms. Own one, and you were signaling your beliefs about government power, individual liberty, rural versus urban values, and traditional masculinity. Don't own one, and you were signaling the opposite. The rifle stopped being just a rifle and became a cultural weapon in the identity wars tearing America apart. You could look at someone's gun safe and know how they voted, where they stood on climate change, what they thought about immigration, how they felt about gender roles. The AR-15 had become shorthand for an entire worldview. Politicians on both sides realized they could fundraise off AR-15 rhetoric without ever having to solve the underlying issues. Pro-gun legislators could rail against confiscation plans that would never happen, warning constituents that the government was coming for their weapons. They'd send fundraising emails featuring photos of AR-15s with subject lines like "under attack" or "final warning." Anti-gun legislators could push for bans they knew wouldn't pass, demonstrating to their base that they were fighting the good fight even if the outcome was predetermined. Both sides discovered that the AR-15 debate was more valuable as a perpetual controversy than as a solved problem. As long as the issue remained unresolved, it could generate donations, mobilize voters, and provide easy talking points that required no nuance or complexity. And caught in the middle were millions of Americans who bought AR-15s not because they planned to use them, but because owning one meant something about who they were in an increasingly fractured nation. For some, it was genuinely about self-defense, about feeling prepared for worst-case scenarios. For others, it was about preserving a hobby they enjoyed, about target shooting and customizing their rifles. But for many, perhaps most, it was about identity. The AR-15 became a way to signal that you hadn't been absorbed by coastal elite culture, that you still believed in traditional American values, that you refused to be disarmed by a government you increasingly distrusted. In rural communities, owning an AR-15 became as normal as owning a pickup truck. It was just what people did, part of the culture and lifestyle. The rifle also tapped into something deeper about American mythology. This country was built on narratives of self-reliance, of individuals standing against tyranny, of citizens capable of defending themselves without depending on authority. The AR-15 fit perfectly into that mythology. It was the modern equivalent of the Kentucky long rifle, the gun that pioneers used to tame the frontier and revolutionaries used to defeat the British. Never mind that the historical parallels were questionable at best. The emotional resonance was real. Owning an AR-15 made people feel connected to American history, to founding principles, to a time when individuals supposedly had more agency and freedom. Here's the uncomfortable truth that neither side wants to admit. Most AR-15 owners will never fire their rifle in self-defense. Most will never need it for the scenarios they imagined when they bought it. The chances of experiencing a home invasion by multiple armed intruders are infinitesimally small. The chances of needing to defend against government tyranny are even smaller. The chances of civil society collapsing in a way that requires personal arsenals are essentially zero. But that doesn't mean their purchase was irrational. They bought a symbol, a statement, a piece of identity in a world where traditional markers of American life are dissolving. They bought something tangible in an increasingly digital and abstract world. They bought control in an era defined by feeling powerless against forces too big to fight: economic inequality, political corruption, cultural change, technological disruption. The AR-15 filled a void that has nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with belonging. Gun manufacturers didn't create that void, but they recognized it and exploited it with precision that would make any Fortune 500 company jealous. They turned a government ban into a rallying cry, military aesthetics into a lifestyle brand, and fear into a billion-dollar industry. They understood that in modern America, consumption is identity. We define ourselves by what we buy, what we own, what we display. The AR-15 became one of the most powerful identity markers available, a single purchase that communicated volumes about who you were and what you believed. The growth shows no signs of slowing. Every political cycle brings new proposals for restrictions, and every proposal drives more sales. Every cultural flashpoint reignites the debate, and every debate convinces more people they need to make their purchase before it's too late. The manufacturers have perfected their formula. They've learned exactly which buttons to push, which fears to amplify, which identities to affirm. They've created a product that's simultaneously a firearm, a political statement, a cultural symbol, and a tribal membership card. The real reason 16 million Americans own an AR-15 isn't about self-defense statistics or constitutional rights or stopping bad guys. It's about what that rifle represents in a culture war where everyone's looking for their flag to plant. It's about feeling powerful in a world that makes you feel small. It's about declaring your identity in a nation where traditional identities are being questioned and redefined. It's about belonging to a community when so many traditional communities have dissolved. It's about control when everything feels out of control. The AR-15 became the perfect product for an anxious age, a physical object you could hold that made abstract fears feel manageable. And until America addresses the deeper divisions that make a firearm feel like an identity, those 16 million will keep growing, no matter how many bans get proposed or how many debates rage on cable news. The AR-15 won the culture war before most people realized we were fighting one. It became more than a gun. It became a mirror reflecting everything broken about American society. The fear, the division, the tribalism, the need to find identity through consumption, the inability to have nuanced conversations about complex issues. Every AR-15 sold is a symptom of deeper problems that have nothing to do with firearms and everything to do with who we've become as a nation. The gun manufacturers just figured out how to profit from it.